My name is Dr. Adi Jaffe, and I'm an ex-meth distributor who sold hundreds of pounds of meth. And this is how crime works. Being a meth dealer, sleeping in bed with the meth pipe next to you and a gun right to your right, and with hundreds of thousands of drugs in your closet is an insane endpoint. It's not normal. It was like my life got a hard reset. I mean, I had to go right to the beginning. I started selling meth because clients of mine wanted access to meth. And so I started out buying very small amounts from street dealers that I knew personally. So an 8-ball, which is 3.5 grams at a time. The labs I saw in Southern California were a joke compared to even the makeshift labs that Walter had in the RV in Breaking Bad. They were using pots and pans, they were using cups and glasses. It looked like a more typical idea of a messy kitchen that you would see in somebody who was addicted to meth than an actual lab. They rarely had glass beakers or flasks or anything of the sort. The easiest way to describe the smell of a meth lab is an incredibly strong ammonia smell that will literally feel like it can burn the hairs inside of your nose, right? So you could tell the moment you walked into a room where somebody was making meth. Sometimes you would cough right away if you didn't have a mask on you, or it would make your eyes water. Even the smaller labs really took care to put these small kind of hoods or fans right above their main reactions in order to port out the gases. And you'd have the cook and then the 1 or 2 people who were helping him make sure that this was done. So Airbnbs and short-term rentals are incredibly easy places to set this stuff up, because really all you need is a day or 2 of setup, manufacturing, and breakdown, and you can leave. You wouldn't really leave much of a mark as long as somebody had enough time to air out the space and the smell wasn't there anymore. The other thing that is incredible about using things like Airbnbs is you get to move from place to place, which is then really hard to detect, because even if a neighbor does notice that there's a pipe out of a window or something like that, if it's only there for a day or 2 and then it leaves, nobody would know. All the labs that I saw were locally here in Los Angeles for a very long time. But when drug busts started happening in earnest in the late 90s and early 2000s of drug labs everywhere in Southern California, people started moving them outside of the city. And they gradually moved closer and closer to some of the supply sources they had for some of the ingredients, right? And so it was well known in farming communities for a while that you had to guard your nitrogen-rich fertilizer supplies, because meth dealers and manufacturers would go and steal kilos and kilos, if not, truckfuls worth of this stuff, and then bring it back in order to be able to go manufacture their meth. The people that I knew that manufactured had at least one, I'll call it a lab, but what it really was either a van that was hollowed out in the back or a full RV. The idea, in a way, being that if you drive, then nobody can detect the fumes. The only thing that a lot of them forgot was that when you're driving, nothing is stable. A handful of them actually had to experience flare-ups and one actual explosion that I know of. Everybody that I saw manufacturing meth was using the ephedrine method. One of the first things you have to do is you have to get the ephedrine out of the Sudafed pills, right? And so then that ephedrine is put progressively into additional chemical interactions. In the end, what you end up with is essentially a large pot in most of these of a clear liquid that has the solvents in it. And then the next step is really drying that product in order to get the end powder that is what everybody consumes. These were highly detailed, very protected recipes that were guarded by this cook with the same sort of zeal you hear about Coca-Cola guarding their original recipe, right? Because this was their leverage. The secrets were in limiting people's knowledge about how to do what was otherwise replicable. In a world of drug addiction and crime and sort of the underbelly of society, these cooks had standing. A Smurf was the name given essentially to a meth manufacturing runner. Most small-time dealers that I knew would employ 10, 15, even 20 Smurfs. So they would go out to the stores and buy the lye, they would go steal whatever it is that was required for the manufacturing, especially going to pharmacy after pharmacy after pharmacy to secure individual packages of Sudafed. The idea of being able to go, run around, get some ingredients, work for a couple of days and make $10,000 or $15,000 was highly attractive. And so everybody was always trying to get their hand on a good recipe. There's absolutely a connection between the method of cooking the meth itself, the impurities that exist in it after, and actually the quality of the meth itself. So when I was starting out in the meth game in the late 1990s, there was this lore about P2P meth at the time. That was the stuff everybody wanted. That meth had a blue tint to it, so everybody was always looking for blue meth, which was what was so ironic about Breaking Bad when they started, introducing this story of blue meth, supposedly created by Walter. That was what I knew as the best meth you could get from the stories in my dealing days. The demand among my customers grew. My dealer couldn't really supply me anymore. So what ended up happening is we would go on together on deals. And we ended up going together to meet his dealer, a woman named who lived in downtown LA in a massive warehouse with about 12 other people. At the time, a pound went for about $10,000 or so. So they were pretty expensive pounds. I would come in to buy as much product as they could. I would leave there with, a pound and a half if they had really done a great job of manufacturing. And so they would be left with about $15,000 from me. There was a hierarchy. He always got paid in money and it was always cash. Once he got paid, you could tell that there were a couple of other people who actually got money, and the rest of people literally relied on free meth supplies to do the work. The labs that I knew didn't get robbed. The drugs came in quickly and they left quickly because there was the need to distribute them in the moment that they were made. What did happen much more often was when drug dealers would actually get robbed. So after the drugs would get delivered, because they're gonna have a supply on them. So the risk of being robbed actually happened much more often. Obviously the dark web is a huge part of this, to make it so much more difficult to identify, track, let alone apprehend and stop at the source any of this manufacturing or distribution. The supply was really, really unreliable. And what that would mean is 1 month there would be all the meth I wanted, and then other times it would either be incredibly dirty and impure or they just wouldn't have any. Back in the day where they were making this with ephedrine pills, when they were starting to crack down on ephedrine pills in the US, as restrictions started coming up about being able to buy 8 packs, and then 4 packs, and then 2 packs, eventually 1 pack of Sudafed at a time, which really choked the supply. And so like any good salesperson trying to sell any product, legal or otherwise, I started looking for other suppliers. And through a person who was selling me cocaine at the time, I got introduced to another contact. So I had to drive down to Orange County to go to a strip club, and then somebody walks up to you, make sure that you are who you say you are, check your ID. He gives me an address and he tells me to get back in my car. And eventually we found ourselves on a dirt road. This was my first meeting with the actual cartel people, and it was the classic meeting you've seen in every single movie in your life, which was I got out with the money, they got out on the other side, but they had 3 guys, obviously with weapons on them, and we walked into the middle. I gave them the bag of money, they gave me the bag of drugs. One of the big things about dealing with the cartels directly is they were really reliable. Every single time that I contacted them, letting them know that I needed product, it wasn't a problem. I never needed another one because they could always supply what I needed. At this point, over 90% of the methamphetamine sold and used in the United States has been manufactured in Mexican super labs. I believe that given the incredible proliferation of these super labs south of the border, it's become almost redundant to have local labs. The manufacturing is easier, it's more reliable, the product is cheaper at scale. They can absolutely employ real talent. So they can hire real chemists and people who really know what to do at the higher levels. But as you go downstream, they're offering sometimes pretty well-paying jobs given what else is available in the surroundings. You need a lot more money in the US to buy your way out of law enforcement regulation. We all know it's doable, it's just a lot more expensive. In Mexico, it's much, much cheaper to buy enough police power in your pockets. So these meth super labs, they're relative super labs, right? They're making thousands or maybe tens of thousands of pounds a year. So there's been a huge shift back to P2P meth in the United States and in Mexico. P2P meth actually ends up being stronger than ephedrine-based meth, creating massive problems, mental health issues, larger incidents of things like psychosis from meth, et cetera. And that's creating a bigger crisis around meth use right now than we've seen in a long time. The honest answer as to why I stopped selling drugs is I didn't see a way where I could keep doing it and still live a life that was outside of gates. Everybody that I knew who sold drugs ended up either dead or in prison at some point. I never saw anybody get out of that world intact. I got in my motorcycle accident in 2001 and I got found with, it was cocaine, but I got found with a half a pound of cocaine on me. And police knew that somebody with a half a pound of cocaine in their jacket knows somebody who sells drugs a quantity. They obviously searched the entire place, right? And started looking through the walls, looking through the ducts, the AC ducts, and they found toxic chemicals because one of my friends who was manufacturing meth actually left some of the chemicals in my house. I had a lockpick kit, and that was illegal to carry. I had a gun that was loaded by my bed, and you get a violation for every single substance you have. And I actually, even on top of that, picked up 2 charges for the manufacturing of methamphetamine and MDMA. We had a pill press at my place where we were pressing MDMA pills. So initially I was looking about 15 to 18 years. And my lawyer immediately that day told me one thing: it's clear you're addicted to these drugs, right? Everybody can see it on you. If this judge doesn't see that you're serious about changing the direction your life is going in, you're gonna get the full thing. You're gonna get 15 to 18 years in prison. I think that was the only way to sell me on treatment, honestly, at the time. And so I listened to the judge and I went to a rehab in Pasadena here in Southern California. So we did something called an open plea, which actually meant I had to plead guilty to all 9 felonies. But if I pled guilty to the 9 felonies that were still on my record, the judge could make whatever decision he felt like was right, given my situation. And he came out and he gave me this very creative sentence, in my opinion. And the sentence was 364 days, 1 day less than a year. If when you get out, you start selling drugs again, or I see you here again, whatever you do next is gonna have 7 years added to it. And in a way, it felt there was this biblical story about a king with a sword sort of hanging over his head, just right above his head. And it felt like I had this hanging sword that actually was kind of my guardian for a couple of years while I was trying to figure out how to get my life on track. I just want to say publicly, I also recognize mass privilege in who I am, right? And so I may be from the Middle East and I may be actually a first-generation immigrant to the United States, but nobody can tell that when I speak. So standing in front of that court, I was a relatively young adult white male. And so I think there was a lot of privilege afforded me by that reality in that moment as well. When I got out of jail, I tried to get a job. I couldn't get hired for anything. I tried for mall jobs. I tried to become a pizza delivery man, and I couldn't get hired. The only next thing I had available other than a job was to go back to school. So I got to get into Cal State Long Beach, which was the first place I got my master's in. Then I went back to UCLA to get my PhD, where I ended up teaching. And so I ended up taking this route that seems blessed at the end of the road, but it was in no way, shape, or form guaranteed. And there were many, many times along the way that the idea of going back and having that access to money and power was really, really charming. The million-dollar question is how to stop meth production and meth use from occurring. The problem is that the government has been known to try to use prohibition and interdiction, right? Ways that stop the supply or make it illegal to use when it comes to every drug, including methamphetamine. What we've seen over and over is that these methods don't work. And so they became this very deeply ingrained public campaign to make kids, young adults, etc., aware of the meth problem. So you would see the faces of meth pictures and what meth does to you and all that kind of stuff. That's when we started seeing the opioid problem explode in this country. And it was as if we looked in one direction and then all of a sudden, you know, a whack-a-mole game occurred and everybody had to turn their attention to opioids for a while. But in the interim, while everybody was focusing on opioids, the supply and demand for meth started increasing again and again and again. And over the last decade, we've seen a massive resurgence once again in the use of methamphetamine. They are going to meet the need. They're going to meet the supply that is required, and they're going to find any way to do it. You know, I think that focusing on ways to stop the supply of chemicals is just the wrong approach, and it's not something we need to think too hard about. And the real game is to ask ourselves a question of why is methamphetamine use going up? About 85% of the incarcerated population in the United States either have an active drug addiction problem or were arrested for drug crimes. Add to the cost of interdiction, prohibition, etc., which is in the trillions of dollars. Add to that the cost of lives. And on top of that, the cost of incarceration that we don't consider part of the war on drugs because it's actually part of our overall crime fighting measures. When you add all of those statistics together, I think it's pretty safe to say that the war on drugs can be considered one of the most dismal failures of the law enforcement community here in the United States. 10% of the population in the US struggles with addiction as diagnosed by the DSM. Even that number has gone up. So the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, has just raised its own estimate of the people who struggle with addiction in the US from 24 to about 40 million. So this is a problem that affects all of us, and yet somehow we've bought into the narrative that those people are addicts and alcoholics, but we're here, we're normal, and we're safe. Addiction, as we all know, does not discriminate based on socioeconomic status. And we need to get it out of our heads that the people who struggle are other than us because they are all of us. And so the war on drugs has been a war on those people, and that is us. I was selling to my friends when it started out. So the idea of having to be secretive, A, didn't dawn on me, and B, was relatively impossible because they all knew me. I was a student at UCLA. They were all my friends. They lived around me. Everybody in the drug game goes by monikers. So I would meet people like Bullet and Murder and Termite. You come up with a name, and that becomes kind of the moniker that you go by when you're selling. I used to drive, when I started out, I would drive 250 or 300 miles a day in Los Angeles delivering. But really, the moment I moved out of that, everybody came to me, and everybody was screened. And so even though it was never my intention to end up being a guy with a gun walking into a cartel deal outside of San Diego, there were these incremental small progressions that got me there. And what it taught me is that if I put my attention and my efforts on the right things, and I just give it enough time, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, just like my drug dealing career grew, I could actually achieve some pretty incredible things, but now doing them on the right side. I was really scared of telling people that I'd been to jail, that I used to be a drug dealer, that I used to be addicted to meth. It felt big. And so some of my friends knew, my really, really close friends, but what I did instead is, this is 2008, I started blogging about it. And I started speaking publicly, but to people I didn't know, right? Blogging is kind of safe, it's people out there. I then ended up running groups and seeing clients in a treatment center here locally in Los Angeles. Eventually I opened up my own treatment center, and I've pretty much dedicated my life now to helping people with addiction problems. And so in Ignited, which is what I do now, which is an online addiction help platform, I've also written a book called The Abstinence Myth, relying on the fact that you don't have to be ready to quit in order to get your life in order. If you're ready to do something, you should start acting now, even if you're not ready to quit. This is my life's purpose. This is what I do now. And I'm incredibly motivated and grateful and humbled that I get to help people every day.